Chapter 10 of The Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10 A Deal in Ancestors. I came to England with the knowledge that I had no pedigree worth speaking of on one side of me, the English side. Perhaps I should correct that statement, for, of course, if I thought about the matter at all, I knew I did have a pedigree of some sort or other, but I did not know what sort it was, whether honorable or dishonorable, plebeian or aristocratic. The fact troubled me but little for a time. I was altogether too busy trying to earn my own living to spend time and trouble and bus fare running about investigating how my ancestors earned theirs, or whether they got it in some less respectable way than earning it. I knew, however, that they could not have been rich, or if they were, that they must have been selfish spendthrifts, since nothing in the way of legacies in English land or bonds had been handed down to me. On this account I always felt a resentment towards them, and it was my own private opinion that if I ever found out anything about them, I would discover that not only financially, but socially and morally, they were a pretty poor lot, and I had no notion of claiming them. When I had been in England something over a year, a relation in America, whose grandfather was my grandfather as well, wrote and begged me to go to the British Museum and hunt up some data in the records of the Harleian Society. I would there find, he said, that we had among our common ancestors some knights, baronets, and things. With the clue that my relation sent me, I went to the British Museum, and, though I found the knights and baronets, I found also confirmation of even more than my worst suspicions concerning my ancestors. One had died in an almshouse, one had been a sort of pirate captain, so far as I could make out, one had fought against George Washington, concerning one there was but this simple record: born blank, died blank, not worth a groat. One of my far-away removed ancestresses, who, horror of horrors, bore the very name which was bestowed upon me at my christening, had conducted herself in so shameful and disreputable a manner, that her husband, my far-away and removed ancestor, had ordered her to sit upon the steps of the meeting-house from midday till the going down of the sun, with a shawl over her head, and publicly confess her fault, which was indeed a most grievous one. And the lady, so the record ran, did confess. I slammed together with a bang the book that gave me this bit of scandalous information, and started back to the flat, not altogether pleased with my afternoon's work. I had in my purse £2, 2 shillings, and 7 pence, money for which I had many and very urgent uses. The distance to the flat was great, but I did not take a bus, thinking to walk and save the pennies. Passing a second-hand shop, I noticed some old and curious-looking objects in a corner near the door, and I stopped to examine them. They themselves proved useless, but behind them, in a mass of dirt and rubbish, with the dust of ages as well as modern second-hand iron kettles and tin saucepans piled upon it, I discovered a good-sized oil painting without a frame. When I had got the things off of it and dusted it, I discovered it to be the portrait of a kind-faced old gentleman, with brown eyes, gray hair, and an aristocratic expression of disgust at his squalid surroundings. At least that was the way he seemed to look, and one couldn't blame him. From the fashion of his clothes, I fancied he had lived about a century ago, and had been something of a swell. "Want that, miss?" asked the man who kept the shop, noticing me at the door. "Oh, I don't know," I answered. "How much is it?" 18 pence, he replied. I was astonished. 18 pence for a fine old oil painting! I looked at the portrait again, and it seemed to me the old gentleman had a pleading look in his eyes, as though appealing to me to take him away from so horrible a place. "Why, you must see this is no place for a gentleman," he seemed to be saying. "And so cheap, only 18 pence. Do buy me." "I'll have it," I said to the second-hand man. I took the painting home and washed it with soap, and then greased it and hung it on the wall, and the old gentleman smiled upon me and looked pleased and happy. The room was really a very pretty and dainty little place, and though, perhaps, in the bygone times he had lived in a grand old mansion, yet he must have felt that in becoming a part of the furnishings of my abode, he was coming to his own again. Before I hung the oil painting up, the room had been merely pretty. Now it took on an air of grandeur when I looked in that particular direction, and before I went to bed that night I had quite fallen in love with the dear old gentleman, and had named him Grandfather. The next morning when I went to look at him he was still smiling, and I smiled back, and Dinah remarked, "I do 'clare, Miss Polly, dat's de same kind o' pictur which they done hab in my ole massa's house in Virginny." When I went out that day I passed again the second-hand shop, and I stopped and peered again into the dark corners and on the walls, though of course I knew I must not buy anything. Hanging on the wall was an empty gilt frame that seemed to be about the size of Grandfather. "How much is that?" I asked, pointing to it. "Well, it really aren't saleable," returned the shopman, "as there bean't no picture for it. It's scarcely worth sixpence." "I'll buy it," I said quickly, and the bargain was consummated. I afterwards discovered it was too large for the oil painting, so I set to work with hammer and saw to reduce it in size, with the result that in the evening Grandfather was framed, elegantly and properly as befitted him, for the frame turned out to be a really fine thing, after a washing and polishing, the sort of frame one might pay at least 30 shillings for if purchasing new. Grandfather seemed to smile more broadly than ever, even when Judge, coming upon him unexpectedly, stood before him in amazement and barked a full 5 minutes at him. I hung the old gentleman's portrait directly over my typewriter, and all the next morning he smiled down upon me while I wrote my London letter to an American paper. His smile seemed to follow me out of the room and out of the flat as I went with my letter to the post, and after I had dropped it in the box, I took a walk among some of the curious, dingy, old-fashioned streets of the West Central District, where pawnshops, antique and second-hand shops abound. As I walked about and peered into the doors and windows, I kept thinking of the pleased old gentleman who hung over my typewriter, and I said to myself, "What a pity he couldn't have been one of my ancestors, instead of those horrid creatures I've found out about at the British Museum." I didn't believe he died "not worth a groat," or fought against George Washington, or went pirating, and I didn't believe his wife ever had to sit on meeting-house steps and confess unspeakable things. Poor old man! I wondered how he got into that dirty second-hand shop anyway, and got sold to me for a beggarly 18 pence. Nice old man! If I could have had him for a great-great-great-grandfather, it would have been worth while. After all, why not? Why not imagine it? Why not adopt him as great-great-great-grandfather? Indeed, why not adopt a lot of ancestors who seem to be of a decent sort, rather than claim descent from those apologies for ancestors which I had found in the British Museum records? I knew plenty of my country people adopted ancestors that weren't half so nice in appearance at least as was my old gentleman. "I'll do it!" I exclaimed, half aloud, as I stood before one of the curiosity shop windows. "I'll see if I can buy some more cheap. I'll fill the whole flat with ancestors at 18 pence apiece." I looked in my purse. There were still my 2 gold sovereigns and a few coppers. The money I had in those days was the kind of money that was spent before it was got, booked ahead as it were. The installment on my typewriter was nearly due, and most of what I then had I had intended to use for that. But all ideas of economy, sense and reason took flight from my head. The desire for ancestors swallowed up all other desires. It became a sort of intoxication, or rather it became like what I fancy might be the desire and determination of a man to have a drink, no matter what happened in consequence. It became a passion, an overmastering one, and the only bit of reasoning I did was to say, "It must be I ought to do it, else I wouldn't feel like this. If I want anything so badly as this, I ought to have it." "Have you got any old paintings?" I asked, looking in at one of the shop doors. "I don't think so, miss. Everything I've got that's worth selling you see right here exposed to view." "But you might have some old things stored away. Won't you just look?" I answered. "But I know I got nothing. There were a lady 'ere 'arf an hour ago inquiring for frames, whether they 'ad pictures in 'em or not, but I didn't 'ave." "But I don't want frames. You might have some pictures without them." "I got an old roll o' pictures somewhere, but they're stuffed away and I don't know just where." "Paintings?" I asked. "I think they was engravings, and some in what they call ile, too. If I tikes a lot o' trouble to find 'em, I'd want you to buy 'em." "Of course," I answered. He moved away to the back of the shop, and I sat myself on a rickety stool. It was one of the worst and dirtiest of the second-hand shops, and there seemed to be less than £5 worth of goods in the whole place. It must have been 3/4 of an hour before he returned with a dirty roll, which he handed to me to untie and inspect. Sure enough, there were some oil paintings, faded, wrinkled, and torn, among the collection. There were 7 in all, 3 men, 3 women, and a child, so far as I could make out through the dirt that covered them. "How much for these?" I asked, holding up the 7. "'Arf a crown." I handed him a sovereign, but he declared his inability to change it, and asked if I would wait while he went to the public house with it. I fancied I would rather get it changed myself, so I went to the post office and bought some stamps, and then returned to pay over the half-crown. All the afternoon I kept at my task of buying remarkable looking oil paintings. For one that was stretched and in a frame I paid as high as 5 shillings, for some small ones I paid 6 and 10, for others 2 shillings. Finally I had collected 20 and spent 37 shillings for them, and I called a cab because my burden was greater than I could bear. I was glad Dinah had gone for a walk with Judge when I returned to the flat, so that I had 3 hours for scrubbing and greasing the really disreputable looking lot I had brought with me to my home. There were in some of them the most terrible creases. One gentleman, with a ruffle round his neck and a sword in his hand, seemed to have been attacked in the eyes, for there was a hole in one side of his face where an eye should have been. The nose of an aristocratic lady, I found, was only half there, it having been washed and scrubbed, I supposed, many times before. Yet, when I had them all clean and had polished them up with salad oil, I was immensely pleased with them. For some I made frames of pasteboard, covered with old black silk and velvet. Others, after trimming the edges, I tacked directly on the wall, and when I got the room embellished with them, removing all the other pictures from the sitting room, with the exception, of course, of the original ancestor, I must say I was pleased and even surprised at the effect. My room, which had been merely pretty before, now looked anciently grand, and the old gentleman over the typewriter smiled and smiled, and some of the rest of the company seemed to be smiling too. Then I smiled in unison with them, and stretched out my hands in a solemn benediction, and said, "I adopt you all as my ancestors. I hope you appreciate what I've done for you, rescuing you from the dirtiest second-hand shops in London, and washing you and putting you in a clean, nice room. I hope you don't mind being adopted by me. I'm a very decent sort of person, and it may be you've got real descendants you've just as much reason to be ashamed of as I have to be ashamed of my real ancestors." And while I was declaiming to the ladies and gentlemen on the wall, my almost empty purse fell to the floor, and Dinah, to whom I always allowed the privilege of a latchkey, walked into the sitting room with Judge. "Miss Polly, what am de matter?" exclaimed Dinah, looking about in amazement at the walls. "These are my ancestors, Dinah," I answered. "You don't mean dey is your grandpaps and grandmams from way back, like old Massa had in Virginny?" "Yes, Dinah," I said. "Why, Miss Polly, how you done find 'em? Where dey been?" demanded Dinah, aghast, going up to the gentleman with one eye and sticking her finger in the hole that served for the other. "In an old, dirty shop, Dinah. I think they were stolen and sold, you know, and it's lucky I came across them." Dinah was not too skeptical. Poor thing! She was always willing to take my word for even more than it was sometimes worth, and when she had examined each one in turn, and had several times exclaimed, "I guess we's gettin' grand these days," went to her kitchen with more dignity and self-importance than I had ever seen her assume before, saying, "I 'spect we's quality, ain't we, Miss Polly?" That night I amused myself with naming my ancestors, and before I went to bed made out a catalogue of them, as one might do for a picture gallery. I awoke the next morning with a start, and ran into the sitting room to see if I had been dreaming that I had spent all my money on ancestors. I received a shock to find it was no dream, a shock that brought me back to the realities of life and the uselessness of ancestors for purposes of paying installments on typewriters and buying bread and meat and potatoes and postage stamps. Had I been mad the day before, and was I now "coming to"? That was the question I was resolving in my mind, when Dinah, with a new dignity added to her step and a new look of satisfaction on her face, came in with my breakfast. That over, I dressed and went into my ancestral gallery, and sat down at my typewriter, trying to think of something to write about. I could not. My brain seemed to have lost its cunning. My wits had gone a-visiting. All joy in existence had fled. I hated myself for a fool, and the rest of the world for knaves. I cursed my relation over in America for having been the original cause of my foolhardiness and improvidence. 37 shillings worth of ancestors, and nothing for the morrow's dinner! Who had brought me to that? Who but the relation with his nagging letters, that finally resulted in my going a pedigree hunting at the British Museum, finding ancestors, discarding them as unworthy, and then spending my little all in buying for myself a more reputable lot? Were they a more reputable lot after all? I looked around at them and fell a-thinking. They seemed not to smile so sweetly as they had done the day before. Some of them, especially the gentleman with one eye, looked vicious. Some greeted me with cynical, some with, I now thought, idiotic smiles. Even the old gentleman looked grave as he watched my listless fingers move over my typewriter keys, bringing out upon the paper nothing more inspiring than the sentence I practiced when I wanted to get up speed for something that must be written in a hurry. John quickly extemporized 5-toe bags. Over and over again I wrote it, the sentence that contains every letter in the alphabet, and therefore is bound to bring a quick, mechanical action to the fingers if practiced sufficiently. I filled 3 sheets of paper with it. Then I got carbon and manifolded it, and flung the pages about the room, and at 11 o'clock I put on my coat and hat and went out for a walk, at loggerheads with myself and all the world. When I get into an excited state of mind, my only remedy is to go and walk it off. It was so in those days, and I passed to Charing Cross, along the Strand, and to Fleet Street, with no object in view except to walk myself into a state of reasonableness. I turned into one of the streets that went towards the Embankment, then I turned about again and got into a street I had never seen before, Dorset Street, and I saw hanging suspended over a door the sign, the St. James's Gazette. As I have said, I was at loggerheads with myself and all the world, and here was the office of the paper that was always giving me unkind, or at least cutting, notices. It was one of the few London papers that I considered had not treated me fairly. It had once laughed in print because the Times had published my American Girl's Reply to Mr. Rudyard Kipling. It had said, "The lady is very vague and shadowy. It is, indeed, very like reading Mr. W.D. Howells." Now, in asserting this last, I considered the St. James's had added insult to injury. Insult not to me, I hasten to say, but to Mr. Howells, whose works I had read and loved from my childhood up, and at whose feet I would ever sit, as did Paul at the feet of Gamaliel. As I was about to pass under the swinging sign, a sudden resolution took possession of me. The St. James's had treated me cruelly, and I would go and tell the editor what I thought of him. I knew not the editor's name, so as I handed in my card at the waiting room, I merely said, "I would like to see the editor." The card went up, and a boy came down. "Mr. Lowe will be happy to see you, miss. Will you step this way?" said the boy. "What did you say the editor's name was?" I asked sharply. "Mr. Sidney Lowe," he returned, and then I was ushered into the editorial sanctum. A pleasant-faced gentleman rose and extended his hand, but I did not take it. Neither did I deign to be seated in the proffered chair. "I came," I said, trying to wither him with scorn and dignity, "to inquire why your paper is always pitching into me. Why, if you must notice my articles which appear in other papers, you can't say something pleasant as the rest do. What objections have you got to me?" "None whatever, my dear young lady, except that you take all your clever things to other papers instead of favoring the St. James's with them," answered the editor, still standing and smiling. Did ever American man have so apt and gallant an answer for blustering American maiden, I wonder? Truly, if so, I never heard of it. And yet I had heard that Englishmen were devoid of chivalry as compared with American men, that they had no pretty speeches at their tongues' ends as had my own countrymen. I was astonished and nonplussed into answering, with wide open eyes, "Is that it? Is that really the reason?" "I give you my word it is," returned Mr. Lowe, again offering me his hand and then a seat, both of which I then took. "Now, I hope you have come with some brilliant suggestion for an article for the St. James's?" Oh yes, I returned, trying to be as ready-witted and save myself as well as he himself had done. "Let me see. I was going to ask you. Dear me, where was my American ingenuity, my quickness in an emergency, even the good, ordinary common sense that I thought I had possessed before I went out and spent all my money on ancestors? What was that? Ancestors? A sudden inspiration came. I was going to ask if you would care for an article telling how easy it is for Americans to buy ancestors and pedigrees in London and pass them off for their own." "What?" asked Mr. Lowe, looking interested. "It's astonishing," I continued, "how cheaply old oil paintings can be bought, and how Americans can go to certain people who will manufacture pedigrees for them. And then, you know, American heiresses buy their way to court and kiss the Queen's hand. American money can do anything in England." "How do you know that?" he asked. "Oh, I can prove it," I answered readily. "Why, I know it's so, but I can get still further proofs." "I like that idea. It ought to make not only one, but several articles," said Mr. Lowe, when I had told him of some of the proofs I had already at hand. I went home in the best of humor with myself and all the world, and I kissed every ancestor in the flat, and they all smiled as they had done on the evening before. The old gentleman looked down beamingly upon me as I began pounding out upon my typewriter the first chapter of a series which described the power of the almighty dollar in London society. It took me some time to finish it, but when it was written and published, and all London was talking about it, and wondering whether it could possibly be true, I was able to think quite calmly over the sum I had expended for my ancestors. For several weeks I continued to work, surrounded by that noble company of adopted forefathers and foremothers, till one afternoon some American friends called upon me. "Why, this room is quite a picture gallery, and the paintings are not so bad, I vow," one of them exclaimed, examining them critically. "Rather ancient in more ways than one, some of them look. Who are they?" "My ancestors," I answered. "What?" "Yes, my ancestors," I returned, going over to one of the most ancient-looking gentlemen among them. "I'll name them one by one as you point them out." "Well, who's this?" nodding at one with a sword in his hand and a seal ring on his finger. "That," I said, "is, or rather was, for as you can see he lived in very ancient times, the Duke of Banks." "Duke of Banks?" he repeated incredulously. "I don't know much about the English dukedoms, but I know there has never been such a person as the Duke of Banks." "And Brays," I went on, appearing not to notice his interruption. "He was a Scotchman, was my ancestor, the Duke of Banks and Brays. You know the song about the Banks and Brays of Bonnie Doon, don't you? Well, you see—" I was not allowed to finish my enlightening explanation of the origin of my surname, for I was again interrupted with shouts of derisive laughter from the whole company. Then I told the truthful account of my search after ancestors, which had ended in my buying at a bargain (I did not tell how cheaply) a job lot and adopting them. "What will you take for them?" said one of my visitors. $100, I answered in jest. "All right, I'll buy them at that price and take them back to New York as a speculation." And the next day my walls were cleared of oil paintings, and the other and daintier pictures put back in their places, and with £20 in my hand, besides the check for my articles in the St. James's, I felt that I had made rather a profitable deal in ancestors. End of chapter 10.